The registry took exactly 9 minutes to alter 40 years of collective human construction. Inside the Sovereign Council chamber, the high bureaucrats of the Thavari Sovereign Navy did not look up from their terminal slates as the decree went through. They simply reclassified 3 billion people as restricted planetary assets with a single keystroke. No warning was transmitted across the long-range communication arrays. The central authority assumed that a quiet sector required no explanation, and that the border worlds would simply absorb the change. Down in berth 7 of Orinvas Station, a short-circuiting port running light on the cargo hauler Pale Ember skipped every third illumination cycle with a faint spark. It threw a regular interval of shadow across the scratched designation plate on the hull. The ship looked old, its plating darkened by grease and the grit of unwashed docking docks. Automated loaders hummed along the gantry, clearing heavy wooden grain boxes from the lower staging bays without a single customs officer inspecting the structural shell underneath. The station itself smelled of recycled air and the bitter mineral bite of ion-filtered cooling grids. It was a normal day on the shipping manifests, but the numbers on the local sector board had already ceased to update. A clerk at the fuel desk yawned, his fingers flicking a plastic stylus against his knee. He was the only official left on the primary lower tier, and he did not notice when the telemetry logs for the outer corridor began to drop their active signatures. Then the local star went dark. It was not an eclipse. 47 human warships phased out of total invisibility simultaneously, box-locking every major naval corridor inside the core sector. They held their positions with weapons fully charged but locked on neutral profiles, turning the Empire's primary administrative hub into a theater of complete navigational paralysis without discharging a single thermal round. The defensive grid did not even drop its shields because the incoming mass was already sitting inside the tracking line. Would you have stayed, or would you have run because she didn't run? 48 hours before the dark hulls blocked the sun, Captain Dara Voss sat in her command chair inside the engineering module of the Pale Ember. Her palms were completely flat on the rusted metal of the console, her cold, green eyes fixed on a slow-rolling column of passive telemetry data. The ship was coasting through the outer boundary of the Vel Stretch, a heavily patrolled gauntlet of 9 surveillance stations that marked the edge of core space. The Thavari Navy kept this corridor locked under an unceasing wave of active sensor sweeps. The thermal bleed on the secondary fuel cells is rising, Lieutenant Obi Dale said, his fingers twitching over the low-frequency dials. He did not look back at the captain. The station at the 3rd checkpoint is throwing a wideband pulse. If they increase the cycle by 2%, they will catch the shadow of the lower deck. Keep the left array sputtering, Dara Voss said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any rising heat or haste. And pristine ship invites a second look from the border authorities. Let them see the bad wiring. They expect us to be poor, Obi. Outside the thick viewport, the massive block of a Thavari patrol cutter drifted past, its blue hull lights casting a pale glare across the freighter's nose. The cutter was 8 times the size of the hauler, its side ports bristling with heavy particle tubes. To the crew of the cutter, the Pale Ember was just another old transport carrying low-grade fertilizer to the corporate farms on the interior. The registry showed 40 years of identical runs, 40 years of signed manifests, and 40 years of quiet compliance. Below the main deck, engineer Petra Holt regulated the coolant lines by hand, using a heavy iron wrench to turn the manual valves whenever the automated pumps clicked. The floor plates vibrated against her boots with a low, rhythmic thud that stayed just within the station's baseline noise parameters. A single true engine signature would trip the grid, but the freighter wasn't using its primary thrusters. It was falling through the corridor on gravity drift, disguised as a piece of dead cargo. The central console is stable, Obi muttered, his breath fogging the small glass screen of his terminal. But the registry just pulled our home sector rolls from the main archive. They are clearing the historical files for Sector HR-9. Dara did not move her hands from the flat metal. She had spent 20 years in these deep corridors, watching the high bureaucrats reclassify independent worlds via unreviewed legislative edicts. Every time a territory was cleared, the Sovereignty Council followed the same mechanical routine. They withdrew the local currency, altered the navigation beacons, and waited for the colonial defenders to run out of spare parts. "Let them clear the ledger," Dara said softly. "The paper doesn't change the weight of the metal." The hauler entered the shadow of Orinvas Station 6 hours later. The massive orbital structure looked like a spiked wheel against the cold dark, its central hub glowing with the luxury lights of the high administrative sectors. Ambassador Sylvan, an observer from the Kasari diplomatic mission, stood by the primary safety railing of the observation deck on Tier 3, her thin gray fingers extending and retracting along the brass rail as she watched the pale ember drift into Berth 7. As an information broker from a species denied voting rights in the core councils, Sylvan possessed an exceptional institutional memory. She knew that the Thavari Sovereign Navy relied entirely on what its registries told them. If a ship did not possess an active military transponder, it did not exist as a tactical threat. The Empire's deep arrogance equated administrative silence with an inability to fight. "They are altering the border designations in the upper chamber right now," Sylvan said into her collar receiver, her large, dark eyes reflecting the red status lights of the docking bay. "The Thavari Admiral has 12 victory cords on his chest and an army of clerks behind him. He isn't looking at the freight decks, Captain." "We are tracking the session," Dara's voice came back through the low-frequency loop, thin and distorted by the station's ion fields. "Is the council floor secure?" "The floor is open for another 20 minutes, Sylvan replied, her fingers tightening on the rail as she saw a team of Thavari security guards move toward the lower cargo elevator. "But the guards are moving down. They have an order to impound the ship's log." Inside the command module of the Pale Ember, Obi Dale looked up, his face pale under the green console glare. "The security team just hit the primary gantry. They are 3 minutes from the airlock." Dara Voss did not lift her hands from the console. She simply shifted her gaze to the auxiliary screen, where a small, red icon began to blink next to the freight deck storage controls. The central console revealed that the entire lower freight deck was a structural shell, built to shield a 20-year-old classified displacement core. The technological hurdle of mass displacement cloaking had been solved by human engineers 2 decades prior, without a single test signature being leaked into the core network. "Activate the first array segment," Dara commanded. "We are still tied to the station's primary power grid," Obi said, his hand hovering over the breaker switch. "If we pull the core online while the lines are connected, it will trip the main terminal breaker on Berth 7. "Good," Dara said. "Let them think we have a bad generator." The left running light on the ship's nose sputtered twice, then died completely as the heavy displacement core began to draw power from the local line. In the High Council chamber 3 miles above the berth, the lights flickered once, but Admiral Ren Sorth did not stop speaking. He was 8 feet tall, his iridescent blue crest scales glistening under the crystal chandeliers as he signed the final page of the reclassification decree. His left hand constantly tapped an amber luxury glass against the mahogany table. "The border sectors are now under corporate governance," Sorth announced to the assembly, his 4 eyes scanning the row of silent delegates. "The human populations will have 9 days to register their compliance or face administrative relocation. There will be no further debate." Sylvan stepped through the rear doors of the chamber, her gray robes dragging slightly on the polished stone floor. She did not look at the Thavari guards who lined the walls. She walked straight toward the central podium, holding a single, ancient parchment roll that had been salvaged from the old colonial archives before the reclassification began. "Admiral," Sylvan said, her voice precise and clear enough to echo off the high obsidian walls. Under the terms of the initial core charter, an independent sector cannot be reclassified while its primary transport infrastructure is actively engaged in core trade. Sorth paused, his left ear twitch signaling his immediate irritation. He looked down at the Kasari observer with a casual dismissal that had been honed through 40 years of uncontested governance. The transport infrastructure of that sector consists of old cargo haulers and scarred salvage ships. They have already been logged as obsolete. They may be obsolete, Sylvan said, her gray fingers unrolling the parchment, but they are still within the grid. Down in berth 7, the airlock door groaned as the Thavari security team slammed a mechanical bypass tool into the external control panel. The metal began to screech as the seals gave way, throwing a spray of white frost across the gantry floor. Inside the command deck, Petra Holt braced her feet against the bulkhead, her heavy wrench gripped tight as the system gave its first full tactical hum. "The core is at full capacity," Obi shouted over the rising whine of the displacement field. "The tracking lines are locked. We are ready to alter the spectrum." Dara Voss closed her green eyes for one brief second, listening to the familiar rattle of her old ship as the secret technology began to bend the light around the hull. "Phase the fleet," she said. The central tracking screen in the council chamber did not flash red. It simply went black as 47 military profiles materialized where the empty shipping lanes were supposed to be. Admiral Ren Sorth stayed his hand above his amber luxury glass, his four eyes widening in pairs as the tactical grid began to list the mass displacement metrics. The automated defensive system did not fire a single battery. The target profiles were already sitting inside the core tracking shield, parked less than 3 miles from the Council's panoramic viewports. "The registry is not responding," the chief prelate whispered from the lower tier, his fingers trembling as he tried to force a reboot command into his slate. "The network shows the lanes are clear. The sensors say there is nothing out there." "Your sensors read what your archives allow them to read," Ambassador Sylvan said, her gray fingers remaining flat against the cedar podium. "For 40 years, you accepted our fuel manifests without checking the displacement drift. You believed we were carrying grain because the paper said grain." Outside the crystal glass, the vast, scarred flank of a human dreadnought slid into the light of the local star. Its hull was dark, unpolished, and covered in the pitted gray primer of a shipyard that did not exist on any imperial map. It did not carry the clean lines of the Thavari Sovereign Navy. It was a block of industrial iron, cold and heavy, with 40 hidden weapon bays rolling open along its primary midsection. Admiral Sorth stood up, his massive 8-foot frame casting a shadow over the front row of delegates. The iridescent blue scales along his cranium bristled with an immediate defensive heat. "This is an unregistered violation of core transit space. Clear these vessels from the Gauntlet or the core fleet will reduce your home sectors to slag." "The core fleet is currently holding position at the 6th checkpoint," Sylvan replied, her voice remaining low and detached. "They cannot alter their vector because the pale ember just grounded the primary terminal circuit in berth 7. The entire Vel stretch is locked under a baseline power loop." Down in the dark belly of Orenvast Station, the Thavari security guards who had breached the freighter's airlock stopped in the middle of the gantry. The interior of the transport was no longer lit by the sputtering yellow running lamps. A deep, violet resonance was radiating from the floor plates, vibrating through the guards' thick armor until their secondary heads-up displays began to flicker and reset. Lieutenant Obi Dale did not look at the security team through the internal monitor. He was tracking the deployment times of the 47 colonial warships as they settled into their neutral targeting profiles. "The seconding light on the 3rd sector gate just went dark," he reported, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "The Thavari picket line is trying to clear the gate by manual override." "Let them try," Dara Voss said, her eyes never leaving the main corridor map. The manual override requires 3 minutes of synchronized power distribution from the central hub. Petra, pull the secondary breaker. In the lower engine well, Petra Holt slammed her iron wrench down across the auxiliary terminal gate. A brilliant white spark erupted from the ungrounded circuit, filling the room with the sharp smell of ozone and burnt copper insulation. The vibration under her boots died instantly, replaced by a heavy, unmoving silence as the freighter completely severed its physical connection to the station's grid. Upstairs, the security team's mechanical bypass tools went dead. The gantry elevator groaned, stalled between levels, and locked its safety clamps into the steel guide rails with a loud metallic crash. The guards were trapped in the lower tier, surrounded by unmoving automated freight loaders and crates of uninspected cargo that had suddenly become tactical blind spots. In the high council chamber, the silence grew heavy enough that the rhythmic tapping of Sorth's amber glass became the only sound left on the floor. He looked down at the data display on his wrist console. The numbers were no longer moving in standard sequences. The tracking lines were cycling through old registries from 40 years ago, flashing the names of human colonies that had been marked for corporate reclassification. "This is a bluff," Sorth said, though his left ear twitch returned with a rapid, erratic rhythm. "You have 47 independent hulls. The core fleet has 12,000 capital ships within 3 hours of this station. 12,000 ships that are currently scanning the empty space outside the perimeter," Sylvan noted, pointing her thin finger toward the black viewport. "They are looking for a jump signature that never occurred. The fleet didn't enter the sector today, Admiral. They have been holding station drift in these lanes for 12 consecutive days." The revelation caused a low murmur to ripple through the back rows of the assembly. A minority block of border delegates, who had spent the last 9 minutes sitting in silent compliance, began to reach for their communication slates. They were not checking the military feeds. They were checking the trade registries. If the core channels were closed for even 4 hours, the corporate alliances that held the Thavari hegemony together would begin to lose millions of credits per minute. "They aren't here to fire," Sylvan continued, her large eyes fixed on the Admiral's blue crest. "They are here to confirm that your records are accurate. If you look at the registry now, you will find that Sector HR9 is no longer listed as a restricted asset. The system has already updated the sovereignty tags." Sorth slammed his fist onto the table, shattering the amber glass into a dozen clean fragments that scattered across the unreviewed files. "Who authorized the entry change? No clerk has the security clearance to alter a core decree while the council is in session." "The entry wasn't changed by a clerk," a new voice said through the chamber's wideband channel. The communication array on the central wall flickered, replacing the Thavari naval emblem with the close, green-eyed profile of Captain Dara Voss. She was sitting in her scarred command chair, her hands still resting flat on the console behind her. She looked old, tired, and completely unbothered by the row of guards aiming their sidearms at the projection screen. "We didn't change the files, Admiral," Dara said, her voice echoing through the high hall with a clinical patience. "We simply completed the unreviewed registries you gave us 40 years ago. You told us to select our ground within the boundaries of the core transit law. We selected this corridor." "You have 4 hours to verify the correction," Dara added, her green eyes locking onto Sorth's four-eyed gaze through the transmission line. "At the end of those 4 hours, the displacement fields will shift by 2%. If that happens, the tracking shield won't just fail. It will reclassify this station as an empty coordinate." The screen went black before the Thavari security prelate could trace the signal source. Outside the window, the 47 human hulls remained perfectly still, their weapon profiles glowing with a neutral, unblinking red that cast long shadows across the council floor. The room waited, the silence stretching past the 10-minute mark as the high bureaucrats realized they were no longer looking at an empire they controlled, but an architecture they had spent 40 years helping to build. The first alarm did not sound like a siren. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency click that vibrated directly through the floor plates of the High Council chamber, shorting out the secondary decorative chandeliers. Admiral Ren Sorth did not drop his arms to his sides. His broad shoulders remained tense, his remaining 4 eyes tracking the tactical display as the automated defensive net reported a total power drop across the lower terminal gates. The countdown had begun, and the station's primary tracking shield was already losing its baseline resonance. "The minority delegates are leaving the chamber," Ambassador Sylvan said, her gray fingers lifting from the cedar podium as the rear heavy doors cycled open. "They are not running from the warships, Admiral. They are running toward the trade subnets to salvage their logistics assets before the 4 hours expire. The security team will clear the freighter within 10 minutes, Sorth barked, his left hand tightening into a fist above the shattered fragments of his luxury glass. "They have tactical cutting tools and full authority to breach the primary reactor core. We do not alter core decrees under a border threat." "The security team is currently sitting in the dark between the 4th and 5th gantry decks," Sylvan noted, her voice dropping to a detached whisper that carried across the emptying hall. "They cannot use their cutting tools because the atmospheric venting lines are locked from the inside. Your men are breathing recycled tank air, and the tanks are on a standard maintenance cycle." Down in the engineering module of the Pale Ember, Lieutenant Obi Dale did not lift his gaze from the terminal map. His green console light reflected the rapid drift of the Thavari naval pickets as they tried to reform their lines outside the Vel stretch. "The corporate vessels are breaking formation," he reported, his fingers tracing a widening gap in the station's defensive perimeter. "The civilian freight haulers are refusing to take the transit handshakes. They are drifting toward the outer marker." "They know how a ledger works," Captain Deravas said, her palms remaining flat against the scratched metal. "When the risk outruns the profit, the paperwork means nothing. Petra, how is the core drift?" "The displacement field is holding its shape," Petra Holt shouted from the lower well, her wrench tapping against a copper conduit to test the resonance. "But the left-running light circuit is beginning to heat up. If we keep it ungrounded for another hour, the feedback will cook the primary telemetry array." "Leave it ungrounded," Dara said, her unblinking green eyes fixed on the local star's glare. "It reminds them how small we looked right up until the grid changed. Let them watch the spark." Outside the crystal viewport of the council chamber, the scarred snout of the freighter stayed perfectly still against the dark background. The faulty running light continued to skip every third cycle, throwing a rhythmic pulse of orange fire across the Thavari flagship's main sensor pod. To the naval analysts tracking the ship from the central hub, that single broken circuit looked like a mechanical failure. They spent 20 minutes trying to calculate a tactical approach, based on a vulnerability that had been engineered 2 decades ago. Admiral Sorth turned back to the primary display table, his 4 eyes locking onto the chief prelate who was still trying to force a override code into the system core. "Use the manual sector keys," the Admiral commanded. "The keys bypass the station's power loop. We can activate the orbital batteries by direct wire." The chief prelate reached into his uniform tunic, pulling out a heavy brass cylinder that contained the physical sector codes for the entire core network. His hand was shaking so violently that the cylinder slipped from his fingers, clattering against the mahogany table before rolling into the pile of unreviewed border files. He did not look at the Admiral. He reached out, his fingers fumbling with a small leather pouch at his belt, and pulled out a plain iron key that was not listed on any naval manifest. He did not insert the key into the console. He set it down next to the brass cylinder and went completely still, his 4 eyes staring at the blank screen with a sudden, absolute blankness that had nothing to do with the alarms. "The key doesn't fit the terminal, Admiral," the prelate whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual bureaucratic rhythm. The key is for an old colonial lock on Sector HR9. My family has held the land registry for 3 generations. The system just notified my personal account that the ground has been reassigned to a human defense collective. Sorth stepped toward the table, his iridescent blue crest scales turning a dark, bruised purple as he looked at the plain piece of iron. Who authorized that transfer? The sovereignty tags are locked under my signature. Signature was validated by 40 years of compliance, Sylvan said, stepping between the Admiral and the display table. Every time your clerks accepted a human transport file without a formal protest, they signed a subclause in the initial core charter. A sector that maintains continuous trade registry during an administrative transition becomes a sovereign enclave if the core grid fails to provide continuous navigation signals. You drop the signals when you lock the terminal gates. The revelation did not cause a roar of anger. The remaining officials in the chamber simply stopped speaking, their eyes moving from the plain iron key to the giant projection screen that still showed Dara Voss's green-eyed profile. The entire administrative mass of the Thavari Sovereign Navy had been undone not by an explosive charge, but by the very rules they had used to reclassify the border worlds. The warships are changing their profiles, Obi Dale reported from the hauler's deck, his voice rising for the first time. They aren't holding neutral anymore. The Dreadnought Iron will just painted the council chamber's primary support columns with a low-frequency targeting lock. Hold the lock, Dara Voss commanded, her green eyes never flinching. We are not negotiating the validity of their records. We are confirming they possess the tools to correct them. Admiral Ren Sorth did not look back at the plain iron key resting on the unreviewed border files. He stepped closer to the primary crystalline viewport, his broad-shouldered frame casting a dark silhouette against the glare of the local star. Outside, the unpolished snout of the Dreadnought Iron will remain locked in place, its weapon profiles humming with a steady crimson light that painted the council's mahogany table. The 4-hour deadline was no longer a theoretical projection on a clerk's terminal slate. It was a physical weight, settling over the high bureaucrats as the station's primary tracking shield began to lose its structural coherence. The automated batteries are not acknowledging the manual sector keys, the chief prelate said, his gray fingers moving away from the brass cylinder. He reached into his leather pouch, pulled out a small cloth, and began to wipe a smudge of grease from his terminal interface. He cleaned the glass with slow, circular strokes, his movements deliberate and quiet while the secondary alarms continued to click through the floor plates. Then he stopped, his hand freezing on the panel as the tracking network initiated its final diagnostic cycle. The central wall screen flickered once, updating the sector map with 32 corrective updates that had been bypassed during 40 years of unreviewed governance. The administrative mass of the Thavari Sovereign Navy did not collapse under a salvo of thermal rounds. It simply dissolved from the registry as the initial core charter terms reclaimed the channels, shifting the sovereignty tags of sectors HR7, HR9, and HR12 into autonomous colonial registries. The corporate alliances are formally withdrawing their picket lines, Ambassador Sylvan announced, her voice low and precise as she watched the tactical display update. The border delegates have signed the legislative amendment. They are no longer verifying your decrees, Admiral. They are confirming their own trade coordinates. Sorth's iridescent blue crest scales faded to a dull, ash-gray color. His left ear twitch had stopped completely, replaced by an absolute stillness that reached from his cranium to his decorated chest. He looked at the 47 human hulls parked outside his window, realizing that his 12 victory chords meant nothing against an architecture that had been engineered to use his own rules as a lever. "Clear the berth," Sorth said, his voice dropping to a flat whisper that did not reach the upper tiers of the empty chamber. "Rescind the reclassification order. Restore the original planetary logs for the human populations." "The decree is already marked as void by the system core," the prelate replied, his fingers finally dropping from the terminal. The registration is complete. The ground belongs to the colonies. Down in berth 7, the violet resonance radiating from the pale embers deck plates began to subside, leaving only the familiar, rhythmic thud of the manual coolant pumps in the engine well. The Thavari security guards trapped in the gantry elevator did not break the seals on their helmets. They watched through the narrow viewports as the gantry doors slid open by manual pressure, allowing Lieutenant Obi Dale to look down at them from the primary access bridge. He did not hold a weapon. He simply pointed toward the main transit corridor that led back to the station's central hub. "The lanes are open," Obi said into his headset. "The civilian freight haulers are accepting the local handshakes again." Inside the command module, Captain Dara Voss did not lift her hands from the flat metal of the console. Her green eyes remained unblinking as she watched the dark, heavy flank of the iron will fade back into the phase spectrum, its cloaking mantle swallowing the hull until only the empty background of the Vel stretch remained visible on the long-range monitors. One by one, the 47 warships vanished from the tracking line, returning to the silent station drift they had maintained for 12 days. "The terminal circuit is stable," Petra Holt reported from the lower well, her wrench resting on the ungrounded port line. "The feedback didn't catch the main array. Do we lock the breaker down, Captain?" "Leave it ungrounded," Dara Voss said, her voice remaining devoid of any rising heat or triumph. "It reminds them how small we looked right up until the grid changed." 3 months later, the automated customs agents at Orenvas Station did not use their high-frequency scanners to inspect the lower staging bays of the incoming transports. They adjusted their scanning profiles to look at the empty space between the stars, their terminal slates recording nothing but the cold baseline parameters of the core channel. The shipping manifests were signed without delay, and the corporate files remained unreviewed on the central registry desks. The pale ember cleared the outer marker of the third checkpoint on its routine loop, its old plating darkened by the grease of another low-grade fertilizer run. On the tip of its scarred nose, the left running light sputtered twice, skipped the third illumination cycle precisely, and threw a faint orange spark into the dark. She set her palms flat against the metal casing of the terminal panel. She did not file a report. The terminal face showed a single, updated status marker, sovereignty verified.